Well, good evening, one. Good evening, all. It's 10 o'clock. It's time for Big Hairy News. There is George, and joining us right from the start of the show, we have Dr. David Small and Dr. Mahdis Azarmandi, both from the University of Canterbury, to have a bit of a conversation around a topic that we talked about last night to do with bias and to do with bias within the media. Good evening to you all.
Kia ora.
Hello.
As an introduction, nice to meet you, David. We've never met before in this kind of context. Mahdis, you're an old mate. We've done this a few times. For people who haven't met David before, a doctor of philosophy. So I guess we're going to be doing some philosophizing tonight. That's sort of the plan of what we're going to get up to. And of course, Dr. Azarmandi, fields of research include critical race and whiteness studies. So I think that's probably going to be an interesting perspective to bring into this conversation around bias, if indeed that is the correct word to use for what we're going to talk about. But before we just get into that, everyone okay? George, you feeling well? We all ready to go?
Yes, I've recovered well, and good to be back in society today. Actually, today was my first time back out of isolation, so back on campus, roaming around. Still surprised by the lack of masks, especially after going through COVID. But yeah, all good.
Very good. And Mahdis and David, you guys are still at work right now. This is your 13-hour day.
No, we're not at work. We went after work and we thought, we just, can have a catch-up drink after. And then I said, it makes no point to go home now. We might as well just suck it up and do this in the same space. So we just thought, okay, we just keep going until 10 o'clock. So we went, from work we had like an after work drink and then just stayed up to do this. And then I'll swing back and go home after what's going to be a very, very long day today.
Well, we are incredibly grateful that you guys have hung around to join us today because, George is more of an academic. I'm just a layman buffhead from Dunedin, and I like to talk. And so we want you guys to bring a perspective to this. As we always talk about leading horses to water, that's sort of what we want to do and talk a bit more about this issue and, I don't know, see where we end up. So let's rip into it, eh? Let's rip into the conversation. If you weren't with us yesterday, what I want to do to start with is kind of recap really quickly why we were talking about bias in the media in particular. And we'll go from there and we'll see where we end up. So we reported on a story yesterday that I think came from the day before that Minister Michael Wood had lashed out at Newstalk ZB about a perspective they put out there, not just an opinion piece, but in my opinion, a piece of disinformation that they added to that opinion piece to make the opinion piece look even worse than it really was. Basically, Heather du Plessis-Allen had an opinion piece that she spoke onto her radio show that they then put into writing, which I think I still have here somewhere. Maybe I do. There it is. Entitled, I don't think they are being judgmental. I think they're being realistic. Basically saying that people should not want these Housing New Zealand developments to be built by them. They should complain about them and they should insist. And she literally uses the phrase, not in my backyard. So that's the piece that Heather du Plessis-Allen put out. Now, whether you think she's entitled to do that or it's okay for her to do that or an opinion's okay is one thing. Then what... I don't know whether it was a junior editor or whether it was a management decision, but someone at Newstalk ZB then tied this photo here. If you're watching, you have to be watching, of a street in Mount Roskill that had a photo taken. It's a stock image from Getty, and the photo, if you can see my cursor going around and around it, is of an inorganic collection day. So the appearance that Newstalk ZB has put out about the story is you don't want these beneficiaries living next door to you. And if they do, look what they're going to do to the house next to you. The grass is going to be covered with rubbish. It's not a good thing to have these people living next door to you. She went on to talk about, troubles that some particular people are having with neighbours being The neighbour who lives in a Housing New Zealand house threatened to kill the person living next door to them, allegedly. And I'm saying allegedly because to me, that's not necessarily, if it is true, a Housing New Zealand issue. It's a police issue because it's currently a crime to threaten to kill someone. So there are other unknowns going on here, but the sum of it was that the piece that was done by Heather du Plessis-Allen was pretty anti-beneficiary in my opinion. It was painting beneficiaries with one brush. It was basically saying if they move in next door to you, they're going to attempt to murder you, they're going to cover their lawns in rubbish, they're going to be loud, they're going to be a problem, and you do not want it. Final little point. This is now the article that we're talking about, and as you can see, they have changed that image. So obviously there was a bit of kickback from News Talk ZB, but the image was now changed. And last night, George and I talked a little bit about bias within the media and conversations that happen in the media that portray groups of people, circumstances in a certain way, inaccurately and unfairly, and what that does to us, those of us who are receiving the content. So as my camera flickers and I'm going to have to fix it, why don't I throw it over to Mahdis and David, and you're welcome just to jump in on that and share your thoughts. And and I'll go fix my camera while you guys have a chat.
So I think there's multiple issues. So that one issue is that this is clearly an opinion piece, and sometimes opinion pieces are not necessarily received by people who read them as clearly that. People read them as if they are objective reporting on a particular issue, when really clearly an opinion piece is somebody's opinion on an issue, and it even says that in the title. So this clearly is one person's opinion about state housing. And then this person's opinion obviously, comes with a political message because they have strong feelings about that, whether or not we agree with those feelings. And that is that somehow Housing New Zealand in the neighborhood of regular people, quote unquote, and then we kind of define who are regular people and who are the people who are not included in that. And the message is, you don't want that because those people are not good for your neighborhood and they're not going to be good for you. And when we attach an image to that, we kind of reinforce the opinion that's already in the piece. Yeah. And when news do that, and we are very, very realistic that that's what we do. We use images in marketing because we know it appeals to people. We use images to make something more attractive. We use images to distract from a particular issue. So when we choose an issue, it's never innocent. So choosing an issue of a picture of a house in a beautiful neighborhood with flowers and smiling faces might not reflect the content of that opinion piece. So the opinion piece is already politically loaded because it's clearly advocating for one perspective of an opinion, and then the image matches that. But often people look at news outlets and what they think they're getting is objective pieces of information, which actually, when we think of, psychology and how culture is received, images and words, those are constantly mediated. So when you put that image to that news article, you're kind of reinforcing the message that the author, in this case, Heather du Plessis-Allen, is advocating for. So I think media has obviously kind of a role to play. So opinion pieces are allowed. I think that's kind of the backbone of democracy, that people can write in and share their opinions. Yeah. But sometimes people read opinion pieces in, let's say in this case, this outlet or the New Zealand Herald or Stuff or whatever other outlet, and they don't realize that there's a difference between me writing in an opinion and saying, well, actually, I think George and Pat are just like really annoying people who have no idea what they're doing, and that's my opinion. Then if I write an investigative piece about, oh, these are the choices you made, this is where your money is coming from, right? Like one might be substantiated with information and data, and the other one is literally just my opinion, which could, in this case, be donuts taste better than cookies. But it's a very political message. So if we give that political message a platform and we maybe don't package that in a way that's clearly understandable to the reader. That's where we blur the lines between when is information and when does it become manipulation, or as we call it today, disinformation. And I think that it's good to have opinion pieces in the news. It's really important to have opinion pieces to know where the public is at. But it's kind of sad to see that we're in a time where newspapers and news outlets have been saying that they're trying to do better. They're wanting to address their historical inaccuracies and their one-sidedness. And in the case of stuff, an apology for their historical institutional racism. But then we see that newspapers continue to produce stories that are incredibly politically loaded without making that political message transparent to their readers. So we're leaving it basically up to the public to have the literacy to unpack these really overt and sometimes covert messages that are woven into pieces of opinion that are published in news outlets. So I think that's one of the things I would say. And then the other one is the framing of public housing, poverty, beneficiaries, and I don't want to lump those together. But there's a long history in which we blame people for, I think, their experiences in life. But then we also not only blame them, but we judge them. So we say somehow state housing is a bad thing. And not only is state housing a bad thing, people who live in state housing are also bad people, which I think that's a bigger story for us to unpack. Why is that really, really problematic and harmful? But I'll give David some space to talk to this particular issue of poverty bashing.
And also I guess at some point want to maybe think of why that term media bias as a concept is maybe inadequate for analyzing things like this beneficiary bashing or the political sort of agenda of the news.
Yeah, I mean, it's like these big media outlets just hand over their space, hand over their status, hand over their platforms for horrible right-wing people to just go on these rants, and then that is supposed to be what counts as news. I mean, I remember I'm old enough to remember when newsreaders first started emoting about what they were reading. They weren't just reading the news. They were, Judy Bailey would have a smiley face if there was something they liked and a frowning face if there was something they didn't. And I thought, just read us the news, And then, I mean, that was bad enough anyway because the news was always conservative. But now this line between just opinion and editorializing, in the name of free speech or whatever. And, this is what passes for news now. It really is quite shocking. And if you look at the sorts of themes, I mean, how often do you get these stories about somebody who's 25 who's got a property portfolio or something like that, and of course being that if you had done what this smart person did, you could too. Remember we used to have all of those sorts of things, and now we get back into this attacking the poor. And it's, I have flashbacks to the Bulger years, and Ruth Richardson years and stuff, which was really, really horrible. It was right at the point where, because when National won in 1990, the consequences of neoliberalism and the loss of jobs and all that turmoil was just kind of starting to kick in. And then they put the unions to the sword with the Employment Contracts Act and stuff. And then very soon after, it was 1991, the first or second budget was the mother of all budgets. And, cuts in benefits and cuts in taxes. And they were permanent, those taxes have never gone back up again. And neither of those benefits, a massive thing. And at the same time, there was this, at the same time as, you know, the neoliberal restructuring of the economy was really impacting a whole lot of people in a really harsh way and impacting their standards of living, we were being encouraged to dump on these people and to hate these people. You know, we had the Dob and the Beneficiary campaign. We had, you know, the thing that National and Winston Peters did, the Code of Social Responsibility. You know, it was like the people who have had the biggest kicking in this whole neoliberal onslaught are the ones that we're supposed to be hating on. You know, the Code of Social Responsibility was like, oh, these poor people, yeah, never mind that they're on benefits because the jobs are all being lost because of economic policies that they never supported. If they're getting this, like they're getting something from free, you know, the bludgers and all the rest of it. It's like, and so, you know, if you're getting something, we get things back in return. And so with that whole the Code of Social Responsibility, like you owe us, we're giving you this little bit of money, so you owe us. And that whole kind of hatred of the poor, and that was the 1990s. And you look at how much the gap between rich and poor has widened since then. The numbers of people that are just way below, and you know, with property and all the rest of it, have just got no chance of catching up. Cost of accommodation, cost of living is just like another turning of the screws of people who are already down there. And now we get this, you know, scummy people that we wouldn't want to have living next to us. It's really gross, eh? It really is disgusting. And she was the one. What was that thing she said about Pacifica people?
Leeches. She called them leeches.
Yeah, I mean, what
like,
a piece of shit.
We I think what we see is that news outlets, not just news, I think any kind of information we consume also shapes public opinion, right? So if you're constantly bombarded with imagery and comments and slogans, and I'm just thinking of, you know, 2003 and weapons of mass destruction. The US kept saying weapons of mass destruction, and it didn't matter if there were weapons of mass destruction. People felt that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So I think we're seeing something very similar. By constantly repeating the same political messages, we are shaping people's public opinion who might not know otherwise. So if you're tapping into the fears of people saying, well, you live in a really good neighborhood and you love your family and you love your neighbors, and then suddenly these unwanted, undesirable people could come in and they're getting something that they didn't work for. They're just getting it for free. And not only are they getting it for free, they're also going to be really noisy and dirty in your neighborhood. You might not want that. That's not just one bad message from one person. It's tapping into a history of a talk like that, right? I guess David is saying, like, this idea of us blaming the poor for poverty has actually a much longer trajectory, right? So I think and that's what it does. And it's not saying, oh, here is disinformation. This is not new. I mean, political messages work like that, but we also can't say, oh, I didn't mean to. I am just stating my opinion as if my opinion exists in a vacuum. No, it's not. When you put something on the into an outlet that people think is giving them some kind of an objective piece of information that's verified and double checked and so forth, and they're getting that from multiple sources, that's going to shape their opinion. And that's what it is. It's designed to do that. An opinion piece is designed to shape opinion. It's designed to manipulate you to move from where you are into another direction. And it clearly works, because not only does the information in the article manipulate you towards a certain, you know, like, come with me in this direction, but the images also do that. And they do that very, sometimes like very explicitly and very subtly. I think I can give another example that something I've been noticing is with the outbreak of monkeypox. Particularly in Europe, everybody's really alarmed by, you know, monkeypox outbreak in Europe and Australia. But the images that you see is often of African people, right? Or when people try to raise money for Save the Children to support some lunch program somewhere down the street, they use they use images of people who are not people that live down the street.
Yeah.
So we kind of tap into people's expectations, and we manipulate into a specific direction, right?
Let
And
me-
it's designed to sway opinion.
Yeah, let me throw this in there as well, because talking about the imagery, the other thing we mentioned yesterday based on this article was what Minister Michael Wood had said, because I agree with you about opinion pieces. You know, opinions are like arseholes. Everyone's got one, and opinions put out there is an opinion putting out there. But when ZB then amplified it with the imagery, that's what Michael Woods had a problem about. With respect, the only trash here is the crude stereotyping of state housing communities. I recognise this image. It's a street I know well in the middle of Mount Roskill. Proud, decent people who now have an image of inorganic collection day being used to create an impression that they are lazy, messy, and antisocial. Of course, genuinely bad behaviour needs to be managed by the landlord, but this sort of inaccurate scaremongering, and I would say disinformation, I think it was done on purpose, obviously, is just about stirring nasty class politics and cliques. We'll keep building the houses our family needs. Following on for that, George, when we were talking about this yesterday, we haven't shown this yet, but George has also got some imagery just to kind of expand what the media is doing. Talking about state housing. George, do you want to show that as well? And the idea being, like, we're talking about state houses and they get the worst possible images they can to represent the state houses. So the imagery is going out to, TVNZ, it's 500,000 people. And if you watch this, this is what you think state houses look like.
Yeah, I like this one. It's from the One News budget reporting when the budget came out. But I like this one because it's an example of when it's more subtle. The narrator talks about putting money in places where there's a shortage of houses, but as we'll see, the visuals are very different.
Caps have been lifted to meet the recent dramatic house price increases, and a $350 million housing fund to build affordable rental housing in some of the areas with the biggest shortages.
And my question to George was, why don't they, if they're going to show state houses, why don't they show these ones? Beautiful, manicured, well-kept, probably made with native timber, the state houses that look utterly gorgeous. Why don't they show one of the new developments of state houses? Apartment buildings that if you saw that on a brochure, you might want to buy it. So I think we just wanted to echo, and although you guys have already talked about it, that the imagery that's getting put out there creates or engenders a thought in some people that, look at this. This is these people are in state houses, so they must be dirty and filthy and bad. And look at their gates. They must have tagging all over their gates. It's the only way these people can live.
Because where the discussion inevitably goes is that, like, even a positive, so-called positive portrayal of this is just as constructed and possibly just as politically motivated as a negative view. For example, I might have a crushed up can of Woodstock in my backyard, right?
Probably do.
And yeah, exactly.
I mean, you go past the street in Dunedin and you would think you're in a war zone. I think it creates an image of deserving and undeserving people, right? It creates an image of desirable and undesirable. I have a problem with that because even people whose backyard might be full of, old furniture are deserving. I think that's one problem that I see. Like, a house doesn't have to be perfectly nice looking with a manicured garden for the people who live in it to be deserving of a dignified life. But what we often see is that these images create these distinctions between hardworking and not hardworking, organized and unorganized, lazy and productive people. And I think this notion of production is a really important one as well. But then it also really creates fundamentally this distinction between some people deserve and some people don't deserve. And we do that. We create populations of people that we categorize as disposable, undeserving people, whether we do that because, like they aren't working, or we do that because they don't belong to the, right social class or ethnic group or sexual orientation, but we're constantly creating categories of undeserving, deserving and undeserving people. I would say any news outlet is political. Everything is political. It's just about understanding to read the political messages correctly, like having political literacy, having media literacy. It's very naive of us to say that things don't have an orientation. The moment you put your camera on this angle, there's something else that is not in the picture. But this is deliberate, right? Like this is a deliberate message that's being sent, and this is a deliberate picture that was chosen, whether or not the person was fully aware. And I think that's when people revert to the notion of bias, which I don't find quite useful, because it kind of assumes everything happens on an individual level, and it happens deep down inside of you, and you're not fully conscious of your choices.
Right.
But this political climate that we have created that makes poor people undeserving is not a bias problem, is a systemic problem. This bias that stuff reported about institutionally being racist against Maori in their reporting is not something somebody, oops, I did not realize that. Those are some political forces that are very willful, even if the individual who made that choice wasn't aware of the willful nature that's behind them. So I think that's why I sometimes find the word bias a little, it falls short.
So can I ask you this, Mahdis, rather than, because I'm thinking about, we hear quite often subconscious bias. Like if that editor or whoever it was at News Talk ZB found that photo and that, oh, what a great photo of a group of state housing, and rather than saying, if it wasn't a deliberate choice, rather than saying it would be a subconscious bias, how would you reference it? Well, if that's not necessarily a helpful word, bias, what is it? How would you talk about it?
I think the word can be helpful. As I said, I think I said that just before we went live. Sometimes you shouldn't chuck out the baby with the bathwater. It can be helpful, but some of these entrenched views are much more systemic, and bias refers to something that happens inherently at an individual level. So we don't have structural inequality like poverty, because I, Mahdis, tend to make some mean choices in life against David as an individual. There's a whole history, of, and I would say, neoliberal policies, capitalism as a whole, probably, the dismantling of what the housing market is. And I know that actually a lot of people who go and are trained in communications and are trained as journalists, they're taught that, because fundamentally part of journalism school is to learn about propaganda, to know the distinction between how you report on something and how something becomes propaganda. So we know that people are actually taught that these things, and they would know it. They do detect it really quickly, because when any other minority asks for something, they're like, ooh, there's an agenda, right? Women ask for something, there's some kind of agenda. Maori ask for, anything in this country, there's an agenda. But there's an agenda when we say that we don't want state housing, and this is what people in state housing are supposedly categorically all like, right? So I think this is where I find the word bias falls short, because it disregards these other bigger ideas that are already there before an individual can make maybe an accident, maybe a poor choice or something.
So in a nutshell, that for the simple guy in the room, an inherent or subconscious bias more talks about what I have, but the reason that editor chose that image is likely because he went, oh, this makes sense because of days, weeks, months, years, decades, centuries of this mis and disinformation. So it's not about him, it's about the systemic issue around him that says, well, that image fits properly because this is what the beneficiary image should be, not rather his own personal. They
reached for a cliche. A cliche image, but there's reason it's a cliche image. And when you're in a position of authority and influence in a media outlet like that, you got to understand what are the politics of reaching for a cliche like that in this sort of context, and what that actually means, and Mahdis is talking about deserving and undeserving and all the rest of it. Though the sort of underlying thing, I think, is that one of the consequences, whether deliberate or not, is it's telling the viewer that these people we're talking about are not like us. They make it look as kind of gross as they can, and so there's a disconnect. So instead of people feeling, that could be me, or some kind of empathy, it's like, oh, this is what's going on here, and there's this kind of disconnect between, you see those people as, your fellow citizens who are
They're the other.
Maybe that's right. They are.
Yeah.
They totally are. They totally are.
Yeah. Matthew says on the messaging as well, the discrimination is built into the system. So I guess that's sort of what we're talking about. I was thinking of a couple of things. The first thing. Oh, sorry, you go.
Can I give you I feel like some examples are a little bit more vivid.
Sure.
So I love like Dunedin Castle Street savagery, which was, I had never seen anything like it. But when you see images of how media portrays protest, and when people protest and protest disrupts into some form of rioting or destruction of property, that is always at the forefront of how media reports on demonstrations against usually, like social ills that happen. And it says, oh, people are rioting. So now I don't know if people have ever gone to big sporting events when their favorite team wins, or end of year university celebrations. There's some really serious damage of public property that happens. People are, completely drunk, and there's a lot of rioting that happens. But we don't frame that as, oh, here's the societal ill that's coming at us. Oh, it's going to destroy our way of life. So we have the capacity to frame information in ways that makes it understandable to the viewer. And we also have the capacity to frame information in a way that alienates and makes the reader feel disconnection and removal, and in some ways, rejection of what is being reported. So I don't like the idea of disinformation, because I think that's really deliberate.
Yeah.
The purpose of this piece is, state housing is bad, and I want as many people as possible to realize it's bad, and it's bad because I think these people don't deserve it. This is not me trying to package some hidden message. It's really in your face. It couldn't be clearer. Okay? It's framing it as people are being reasonable. People who don't want state housing in their backyard are not judgmental. They're not being classist. They're not being exclusivist. They're just being reasonable, concerned citizens. It's quite interesting. I think it's the way it says that. It's very obvious. It says, we are different. We have certain values. These people, whoever these people are, because it's never really clear. I'm telling you, they're kind of a threat to your lifestyle, to your neat little picket fence, nuclear family lifestyle.
Who would want them next door?
Yeah,
exactly. And you're an idiot if you want them next door.
Yeah.
Look, I was gonna kind of wrap this part of the conversation thinking about what do we do from here. Like, I do like to try and finish these sorts of conversations with like a where to from here. What can we do? How can we affect or be a part of the solution to what this issue is? Is there anything?
Well, I think first of all, I think media outlets are really important to democracy. Having independent media that reports on things is a backbone to like a lot of things that happen. But by diversifying our outlets and making sure that we don't only have these few, being transparent about how things are funded, I think is also a really good way. And yeah, I just find like literacy is really important. Being able to decipher things that are in front of us, because I can read this opinion piece and I see something completely different than maybe somebody else, right? And part of that is my political orientation. Part of it is my training, but it's making those things transparent. Having good, solid media, I think, is another one. I think I think one of the things that I see is that we're moving away from good journalism to quick, easy clickbait. Has to be fit into a really short amount of words so that people can engage it. But sometimes complex things require more than 140 characters. I think just having, I don't know, like I'm not so good on solutions. I'm like way more better at like pointing out problems and things.
I always feel like it's sorry, David, just quickly. I always feel like it's a political thing. It's looking for solutions sort of thing to think about this theoretically like we have. And I think if you look at bias as an inadequate concept, as one that, if we use that concept, then really people are sort of like, oh, it's just an innate bias, or it's some sort of natural, unchangeable thing.
Yeah.
If we see it as something that's maintained through how the media, for example, anchor their stories with images, if we see how it's produced, then that's political in itself, right? That makes it possible to see solutions.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that that this discussion about trying to analyze and make sense of what's going on in the media is really important, because we are in interesting times here. I mean, and a discussion of the media right now is different from what it would have been 5 years ago, and from what it will be in 5 years' time. There's changing things, and it's interesting, the whole convoy crowd and all that, and the MSM, they're all on about the mainstream media, and it's like, because none of those people were ever into politics before. They're all only just discovered it. It's pretty obvious. It's like they've suddenly realised that the mainstream media is doesn't kind of tell you the truth, but they honestly think that, like, Jacinda Ardern controls what the media plays, what the media publishes, and crazy stuff like that. But there is, at least, I suppose, a skepticism about what is kind of going on there. But even just on the basics of liberal democracy, the fourth estate is supposed to be an important part of society, and ever since the sort of the technological and business changes that have happened, that have kind of gutted mainstream media, we've been left high and dry. We used to complain about bad editorials and all this kind of stuff, and now it's just got kind of worse and worse, because as the daily newspaper, we used to make its money from all the advertising, and then they would use the advertising money to employ journalists to write the news stories, and then Trade Me turns up, and Ali Express turns up, and suddenly all the advertising revenue's gone, and the business model falls over. And so the gutting of the journalistic workforce, even though you could be critical of how critical and inquiring the journalists were, was at least a journalistic workforce and outlets to publish that sort of stuff. And now it's like, there are big influential outlets that are becoming more and more this kind of clickbait, opinion oriented stuff. We haven't quite got the whole Murdoch phenomenon going here, as you find in Australia and the US and so on, and Fox News and so on. But we're heading in that direction, and it's. Sorry, this was the solution part, wasn't it? I'm struggling with more piles of shit here, I'm afraid.
Hey, well, no, look, I've got an idea for it. I mean, I've got an idea for a solution, because people in the chat are talking about Murdoch as well. Carl says how bad this could be if we had Murdoch media driving public discourse. If TVNZ to show negative image, how can we change this? And then Matthew again says, living in Australia and watching election, it was insane watching the Murdoch media at work. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I saw a report, something like the 11 major dailies or something in Australia were all supporting the Conservatives and coming out for them in the days leading up to it. Maybe a small solution, and maybe I'm being naive here, is when we see this, we get on the blower or get on the Twitter or get on the Facebook of TVNZ and go, hey, that's not how all beneficiaries live. You could choose to have different imagery if you wanted to. I mean, it may not make an effective change, but at least it could be something that we could do.
Yeah, but I also think that something on a macro level is to have real actual public engagement around the privatization of something like media, and the undervaluing of journalists. If a journalist is required to tweet 40 tweets a day, write 2 blog posts, and then do an investigative piece to to get their salary.
Yeah.
We have to be realistic of how good the journalism is going to go, and if people also constantly want to be entertained. So I think like we can have these small step solutions that are about what are the things that we can do as the public, but then there has to be a bigger question around how did this happen in the first place? How did we get here, and how do we revert back to something else? And I think those are not either or, they're simultaneous things that could be done, and you know, like different people will be able to do different things.
And there's an obvious you know, part of the solution happening right now, you know, with this show you guys are putting on. This is, you know, generating our own media, you know, other people's media with alternative perspectives. And, you know, you don't get the coverage of that the Herald does or TVNZ does, but you can still, you know, make quite good inroads. And people need to be able to hear the sort of perspectives and voices you put on this show.
Last thing we'll do on this before we move on, Carl again says the Public Journalism Fund was set up to boost diverse voices in reporting, but according to Sean Plunkett, it shouldn't exist if they can't make money. It's a catch-22. Now, I just wanted to speak to that because I did a podcast with Sean Plunkett at the end of last week, and respectfully, I challenged Sean Plunkett on, he's got a model that's not making money at the moment, and he took money from a private investor. So what's the difference in getting funded from the government and then making content, or getting funded by millionaires in Tauranga and then getting content? So respectfully to Sean Plunkett, he's doing exactly what he's criticizing others of doing from. He's just taking it from a different pool of money. And he says it's going to be viable and it's going to be ongoing, and that might be true. And I guess I hope it is, because I want businesses to succeed. But at the moment, the platform is running off money. It's not charitable officially, but money given to them. Like the ODT, some of their stuff is running off money given to them. Yes, by the government. Yes, by private investors. So with the greatest respect to those supporting Sean Plunkett and what he's doing, I don't see it as that different as taking money from the public coffers, taking it from a private business. It's still taking money from someone else with some strings attached, in my opinion.
And I think it's very different taking money from government than taking money from private investors, because the accountability process is hugely, like, it's a huge difference between that. And the transparency around where money comes from and how it's used is also very different. It's different if I get money from the government to run a podcast and if I get money from Elon Musk to run a podcast. There's a huge difference between that. And, you know, like, money isn't just money. And it's also not like grandma that gives it to you for Christmas and you can do whatever the heck you want with that. You know, money always comes with strings attached.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we'd rather want the strings attached to be transparent and for the public to have a say on them, which, if you live in a democracy, is easier with government than it is with a billionaire that is a private person. That's just a personal opinion.
We are going
that's excellent difference between the two.
We're going to move on now to the next topic. Mahdis and David, you are welcome to hang around and stay, but it's been a long day for you. We have quite a bit of audio and visual to play for the next topic, so the conversation probably won't be as large as we've just had, as content rich as we've just had. What will you guys like to do? Are you going to shoot off? Are you going to hang? What's your plan?
Hang for a little bit longer?
Okay.
Yep.
It's probably 20 minutes, maybe half an hour, because there's a bit to get through. Because as we know, there was I have to be really careful, because I used to kind of say, how do you know it's a Tuesday? Because there's another mass shooting in America. Because it was something that happened every day. In fact, we're going to get into the stats at the moment, and we're going to be showing you how at the moment they're averaging more than one mass shooting a day. We're going to go through this and have a look at a few clips of things that have happened, but we're going to start with basically a summary of what happened in Uvalde, and this is the news report that came out. Now, this news report is slightly wrong because it talks about 14 children, and tragically there's more than that, but I want us to set it up to have a look at what happened. Here is some of their initial reporting around the mass shooting in the US today.
He shot and killed horrifically, incomprehensibly, 14 students and killed a teacher.
Police say just before noon, a gunman walked into Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, and started shooting.
The shooter was Salvador Romas, an 18-year-old male who resided in Uvalde. It's believed that he abandoned his vehicle and entered into the Robb Elementary School in Uvalde with a handgun, and he may have also had a rifle.
Abbott says the gunman was a senior at a nearby high school and he shot his grandmother before entering the elementary. Within minutes, heavily armed police rushed to the scene and confronted the shooter.
Mr. Ramos, the shooter, he himself is deceased.
13 children were transported to the hospital for treatment. Witnesses say frantic parents rushed to the school. 2 victims, a child and an adult, were flown to San Antonio Hospital.
This school has children that are in 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade.
CBS News has also learned that multiple Border Patrol agents responded to the school shooting. One CBP agent has been shot in the head. That agent is at a local hospital receiving medical treatment and remains in stable condition.
We do want to keep all our families in their prayers. I hope you do as well. And we also want to respect the privacy of the family.
This shooting comes a little over a week after 10 people were killed in a mass shooting at a Buffalo supermarket. Police in Uvalde say a motive is unknown at this time, and the investigation is ongoing.
The suspect did act alone during this heinous crime.
So there's the story as we knew it at that time. I wanted to talk to a couple of things, and I've got some clips here, but I'll stop as we're going through them 2 or 3 times, guys, and give you guys a chance to respond to anything you want to say. So the Texas Governor, Greg Abbott, was there talking about incomprehensibly this has happened. There is a lot of criticism being put towards him at the moment, and other Republican lawmakers go, well, we can comprehend how this happens by what you guys have done to the gun laws more so over the last few years and decades. One of the criticisms that are coming towards Greg Abbott at the moment is, so I'll read this part for you from this article. Texas Governor Greg Abbott and other state lawmakers have weakened Texas gun laws in recent years, even after deadly shootings at a Walmart in El Paso, a high school in Santa Fe, and a church in Sutherland Springs. Abbott signed a law last year that allows Texans to carry handguns without a license, so-called permitless carry, before the law went into effect in September. Texans need to be licensed, fingerprinted, and trained. Earlier in 2015, Texas passed a law permitting those with concealed handgun licenses to carry a concealed weapon on a college campus. One lawmaker wanted to extend that measure to public schools. And before I take, I guess, the first break for you guys to respond, I wanted people to see in the US what's been going on in 2022. As sad as this sounds, the reason I just refreshed this is the last time I refreshed it, there'd been a new shooting. So at the moment, mass shootings in the US in 2020, number 213. This is day 145 of 2022, and they have had 213 mass shootings. Anyone like to jump in now? You're more than welcome.
I think that I have to say I'm so unfortunately used to news like that from the States, but I was particularly moved today because I think it's the fact that it is a primary school just adds a completely different layer. So we've seen this in the States for a really long time. And the logic always is in states like Texas, but also other states who've got quite lax gun laws, is that guns don't kill people, people kill people. So it really is not about having guns in circulation, is that people who want to kill people will find a way to kill people. That's the logic. But the reality is that it is much easier to kill people when you have access to guns. It's also much easier for you to have an accident that might not be planned and ends in death or harm for other people with these gun laws. But it's been kind of politically framed in a way as tied to inherently American notions of freedom under their Constitution, so that guns are no longer just about this particular item that you can hold, that it becomes this right that's attached to you and what that means as Americans, right? Like this notion of American patriotism. And that's been done over time. Because when people talked about you having the right to a armed militia, I think is what the wording is, was effectively you as a population have a right to a group to defend you with arms against, whatever enemy that you might.
No, it's against the government, a well-armed militia. So it's against a tyrannical government.
I think that's where it went, and now it's kind of been translated. You as an individual have a right to carry a pistol into Walmart. Not only that, you as an individual you should have 16 semi-automatic rifles in your cupboard at home, which doesn't happen overnight. right? Like this culture of normalization of gun possession and tying any form of gun control to a restriction of freedom is a political process. And I think it kind of ties into the conversation we had before, because it is inherently political, and it's created a culture in which violence is really normalized. And I say normalized not only because people think it's okay to unleash violence on other people have become, it's become normalized to wake up to news like that. And even for us as people who are really, removed from that context, we look at that and it doesn't even have that much of a shock value because it happens so often now.
Yeah. It's Tuesday.
And the question then is not only how do you change gun laws, how do you create a massive culture shift? Because this is not only just now restricting the gun laws. There's more guns than people in the United States.
Yep.
And that is not something that is going to be reversible overnight or even within, I think, the next few years, right? There's so many guns in circulation that I think people don't even grasp the extent of the harm that can cause. And we're not talking of hunting rifles, because I think sometimes people confuse that in the New Zealand context, because people associate guns with, oh, you have a gun because you live on a farm, or you have a gun when you're going hunting. No, we're talking about private people have semi-automatic rifles, but also a 16-year-old can carry a pistol, right? Depending on where you live and the way you accessing buying them and the consequences for that is just, it's a whole different system. And the culture shift is the one that I think I find is the biggest challenge, right? Like, I think here people have a fear of, you send your kid to school and you think about what are the biggest threats. You think about traffic, and I kind of joke about that in New Zealand. I'm like, oh, there's not a single predator. If I get lost in the woods, it's, like there's always a stream, the most things you can eat without them killing you. It's quite hard here. And I think the reality of having lived in the United States is that I would go for runs and I would be really afraid to run in areas that didn't have a sidewalk, because I thought if I step onto somebody's lawns, understand your ground laws, they could shoot me. Right? They could shoot me, and nobody, like no family they couldn't do anything about it because people would be in their right to shoot you.
Yeah. Hey, we'll keep going, David. If you've got something to add in, how about you jump in after this next couple of clips, because we want to hear your thoughts as well. So the Prime Minister has commented on this. She went on Colbert. I believe it's on TV and television in New Zealand later tonight. But Stephen Colbert asked her, when we had the Christchurch massacre, how did you just get rid of the guns? How did you how did that work in your culture? And the Prime Minister answered him today.
Why New Zealand was able to do that when we can't pass so much as universal background checks for people with history of mental illness or violent behavior, even though 91% of Americans approve that, want that, on both sides of the aisle. How did you get that done, or how did you New Zealanders get that done? Because I know it was general consensus.
Well, I can only speak to our experience in New Zealand, but when I watch from afar and see events such as those today, I think of them not as a politician, I see them just as a mother, and I'm so sorry for what has happened here. And then I think about what happened to us, and all I can reflect is we are a very pragmatic people. When we saw something like that happen, everyone said never again. And so then it was incumbent on us as politicians to respond to that. Now, we have legitimate needs for guns in our country for things like pest control and to protect our biodiversity, but you don't need a military-style semi-automatic weapon to do that. And so we got rid of them.
And so what are the results of that? Does it feel like a less free country to anyone down there? Has there been any sort of backlash for this having happened?
So we had a buyback scheme. People had legitimately and legally gone out and purchased these weapons, and we'd changed the laws. So in fairness, we said, well, we will buy them back and then we will destroy them. And so that is what we did. Now, we still have work to do. There are still obviously guns that are misused in New Zealand. And so I won't sit here and say that our system is perfect. But we saw something that wasn't right and we acted on it. And I can only speak to that experience.
And she mentioned a buyback. Completely didn't know this. I tweeted out this afternoon something, and was I being a bit pithy or was I making a point? I don't know, but I tweeted out this afternoon, if people like Elon Musk really wanted to effect a change in the US, how about he pledges Twitter money, $45 billion, or about a fifth of his wealth, to getting guns off the street? $1,000 a gun would buyback scheme would get 45 million guns out of circulation. And yes, there are between 300 and 400 million guns in America, but you know, it would be a start. And I know that I'm grasping at straws there, but it's like, could it be something? David, do you want to jump in?
I was just going to say in response to that, you know, it ultimately it needs legislation, and legislation comes from political parties and political, you know, and governments and whatnot, and those entities are inherently followers rather than leaders. You know, the whole world's admiring, you know, what Jacinda did about, you know, after the mosque massacre in Ototahi, but it wasn't very politically courageous for her to do that, because that was a very unusual and shocking thing, and there isn't the same attitude to firearms ownership in New Zealand as there is in the US. So it was kind of easy. I mean, it was the right thing to do, and there's still grizzling people, and a lot of that is actually financed, I think, influenced by NRA money from the US, because they don't want this kind of thing to succeed in what it's doing. But, you know, if you look at Australia, they had a similar thing with the Port Arthur massacre, and they did it, and similar to us, they you know, it worked. It got those weapons denormalized and decommissioned. And, you know, touch wood, there hasn't been another thing quite like that. But I think the difficulty in the US is that there seems to be no political room for a president or a Congress or a Senate to get some political mileage out of grasping the nettle and addressing this issue. I was surprised that he said, did I hear him right, that he said 91% of Americans want background checks?
And we're going to look at that.
I'm confused then. So, I mean, that seems like, you know, that seems first base. Why hasn't that happened?
I mean, but I think his question of, and I know like he asked that in a, you know, kind of like tongue-in-cheek way, and is it now a less free country? Right? Is it now a less free country? And as that's what I was saying, is that this notion of gun ownership has been so intrinsically tied to this notion of freedom that you can't have the conversation about restrictions on gun ownership without having a conversation around restricting freedom, which is a flawed conversation, because, you know, your right to bear arms should not outweigh the right of somebody else to be safe. Which, and then of course there's the I think when we talk about legislation, we can't not talk about the arms industry. We're talking about one of the most financially profitable industries on earth today. So there is a lot of money that is made in the arms trade. So when we're talking about changing this, we're literally telling people we don't want you to make profit. And that's a huge industry here. That's not just here, like around the world. The arms industry is a very, very big industry that keeps producing guns. And even if we don't use them, they're pumped into other countries and cause harm.
I also found myself often feeling uneasy or maybe a bit suspicious of the intense focus in the American context and the New Zealand context after the terrorist attacks in Christchurch, is that the intense focus on guns themselves and gun legislation. I was always a little bit suspicious of that, right? It seemed to be that the nation forgot that 51 worshippers had been killed, right? Because of, you know, a white supremacist terrorist who, you know, learnt those ideas from somewhere, right? From the society that he lives in. And so, and I see this with the Democrats in America as well, is that they will talk about the gun legislation to the expense of other things.
And I mean, this comes what is it, a couple of days after the shooting in Buffalo, which was a white
Yep.
supremacist shooting, which I
Yep,
think
yep.
people also kind of hesitate describing as that, but it was clearly targeting and I think it was a Black community. So they, I think it's important to talk about guns. I don't want to dismiss that, because I think that's an important conversation to have. But I think if we want to think about the shooting in Christchurch and the one in Buffalo and many others in the US and elsewhere, there's another conversation as well, right? Like this is there's another broader conversation of white supremacy, for example.
And on some level, this actually ties back to the previous conversation we've been having about media bias and what the media's got to say, because the Buffalo shooting, for example, the shooter was espousing replacement theory, which Tucker Carlson has been talking about for months and months and months, to a point where he's been so blatant about it, he's now trying to back away from it because he's been tied to the Buffalo shooting quite easily, actually. But we've talked about legislation, we've talked about like a change through government. I'm going to play this as well. Now, I'm playing this for two reasons. One is it's an impassioned plea from a politician. However, I'm going to show you everybody afterwards that don't get this twisted. This is not just a Republican issue, all right? This has been a Democrat and a Republican issue for a long time. And whilst this is a Democrat senator, the Democrats in Senate have done very little about this as well. Maybe they haven't been able to get it through because the Republicans have blocked, but they have not pushed this like they should have. So we have this underpinning and this swell right now because of this horrific event. But it's really, I think it's really fair to go, this is not just on the Republicans. In saying that, this is the senator who was also the senator for the area, I think it's Connecticut, where Sandy Hook was. So he knows about elementary school shooting in his community. And this is what he shared today. This is like 4 or 5 minutes. I want to play the whole thing. But this is what he said on the floor today.
Mr. President, there are 14 kids dead in an elementary school in Texas right now. What are we doing? What are we doing? Just days after a shooter walked into a grocery store to gun down African-American patrons, we have another Sandy Hook on our hands. What are we doing? There have been more mass shootings than days in the year. Our kids are living in fear every single time they set foot in a classroom because they think they're going to be next. What are we doing? Why do you spend all this time running for the United States Senate? Why do you go through all the hassle of getting this job, of putting yourself in a position of authority, if your answer is that as this slaughter increases, as our kids run for their lives, we do nothing? What are we doing? Why are you here? If not to solve a problem as existential as this. This isn't inevitable. These kids weren't unlucky. This only happens in this country and nowhere else. Nowhere else do little kids go to school thinking that they might be shot that day. Nowhere else do parents have to talk to their kids, as I have had to do, about why they got locked into a bathroom and told to be quiet for 5 minutes just in case a bad man entered that building. Nowhere else does that happen except here in the United States of America, and it is a choice. It is our choice to let it continue. What are we doing? In Sandy Hook Elementary School, after those kids came back into those classrooms, they had to adopt a practice in which there would be a safe word that the kids would say if they started to get thoughts in their brain about what they saw that day, if they started to get nightmares during the day, reliving stepping over their classmates' bodies as they tried to flee the school. In one classroom, that word was monkey. And over and over and over through the day, kids would stand up and yell, monkey. And a teacher or a paraprofessional would have to go over to that kid, take them out of the classroom, talk to them about what they had seen, work them through their issues. Sandy Hook will never, ever be the same. This community in Texas will never, ever be the same. Why? Why are we here? If not to try to make sure that fewer schools and fewer communities go through what Sandy Hook has gone through, what Uvalde is going through. Our heart is breaking for these families. Every ounce of love and thoughts and prayers we can send, we are sending. But I'm here on this floor to beg, to literally get down on my hands and knees and beg my colleagues. Find a path forward here. Work with us to find a way to pass laws that make this less likely. I understand my Republican colleagues will not agree to everything that I may support, but there is a common denominator that we can find. There is a place where we can achieve agreement that may not guarantee that America never, ever again sees a mass shooting, that may not overnight cut in half the number of murders that happen in America. It will not solve the problem of American violence by itself, but by doing something, we at least stop sending this quiet message of endorsement to these killers whose brains are breaking, who see the highest levels of government doing nothing, shooting after shooting. What are we doing? Why are we here? What are we doing?
And since he made that plea, it's been released that the Democrats are going to move quickly to clear the way for votes on legislation to strengthen background checks. Now, I read in that they're going to clear the way. That means they could have cleared the way yesterday, or a week ago, or a month ago, or a year ago. And it shocked me when I looked for some information about this to actually see a story about that 91% that you asked about, David, go back to 2013. So since 2013, this has been in the Senate on some level. Obama, Trump, Biden. It's not necessarily don't point the finger just at the Republicans. They might be blocking it. They may be the hurdle, but this is not a situation just to lay at the feet of them. This is a governmental, institutional, have no will to get this done. This has been around for a long time, this desire by the public in America. Mahdis, you said something really interesting. It wasn't brave for Jacinda to make that decision because we all wanted it. America wants this. This is David, not a brave decision for the politicians.
This is a background check. This is I think this is we need to be really careful because when we look at the data of the mass shootings, also a significant number of the people who use those guns are people who got them legally and would have passed the background check. So I think let's not be fooled that all shootings happen by people who would have not gone.
I don't think they're saying that, though. I mean, I think what they're saying is they need to move forward somewhere. They need to make some progress somewhere.
But the conversation here is this is very, very, very low-hanging fruit.
I agree. And they still can't get that, the low-hanging fruit. No. That's the point. They can't even get that.
What would be the argument against background checks? I mean, you put the counterfactual there. So people are saying that it would be unreasonable and unfair and irrational and unconstitutional that if somebody turns up wanting to buy an automatic weapon, you might ask a few questions and find out some stuff about them. Well, I mean, what is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got one more clip I want to play. It's a couple of minutes, and then we can wrap up. Thanks, you guys, for sticking around. You can cut out at any stage if you feel like you need to. But I got one more clip, and I'm prompted by this because I'm a huge basketball fan. A lot of people will have seen this. And there's conference finals going on in America at the moment. And there is a host on Fox News called Laura Ingraham. And once when LeBron James spoke out, she told him on her show to shut up and dribble. She literally said that. You shouldn't be speaking out. You shouldn't be sharing your views. You should shut up and dribble. So today, Steve Kerr, who was I'm a huge fan of Steve Kerr because he was a part of that Chicago Bulls era in the 1990s with Michael Jordan to win all those championships. He's now coaching the Golden State Warriors. And when they finished practice, they'd finished practice for the day, getting ready for a game. Then the shooting happened. Then they had the media scrum prior to the game. And I want to play the 2 minutes of his conversation to the reporters on game day. This is what he said today.
I'm not going to talk about basketball. Nothing's happened with our team in the last 6 hours. We're going to start the same way tonight. Any basketball questions don't matter. Since we left shoot-around, 14 children were killed 400 miles from here, and a teacher. And in the last 10 days, we've had elderly black people killed in a supermarket in Buffalo. We've had Asian churchgoers killed in Southern California, and now we have children murdered at school. When are we going to do something? I'm tired. I'm so tired of getting up here and offering condolences to the devastated families that are out there. I'm so tired of I'm sorry. I'm tired of the moments of silence. Enough. There's 50 senators right now who refuse to vote on H.R. 8, which is a background check rule that the House passed a couple of years ago. It's been sitting there for 2 years. And there's a reason they won't vote on it, to hold on to power. So I ask you, Mitch McConnell, I ask all of you senators who refuse to do anything about the violence and school shootings and supermarket shootings, I ask you, are you going to put your own desire for power ahead of the lives of our children and our elderly and our churchgoers? Because that's what it looks like. It's what we do every week. So I'm fed up. I've had enough. We're going to play the game tonight, but I want every person here, every person listening to this to think about your own child or grandchild or mother or father or sister, brother. How would you feel if this happened to you today? We can't get numb to this. We can't sit here and just read about it and go, well, let's have a moment of silence. Yeah, go Dubs, you know. Come on, Mavs, let's go. That's what we're going to do. We're going to go play a basketball game. And 50 senators in Washington are going to hold us hostage. Do you realize that 90% of Americans, regardless of political party, want background check, universal background check? 90% of us, we are being held hostage by 50 senators in Washington who refuse to even put it to a vote, despite what we, the American people, want. They won't vote on it because they want to hold on to their own power. It's pathetic. I've had enough.
Wow.
So there you go. Yeah. And look, I don't know if this is a little bit overly dramatic for me. I don't want it to be. But, you know, everyone, you know, Jacinda was talking about she's thinking like a mother tonight. Steve Kerr is talking about he's just thinking about kids and grandkids and, you know, all those people out there. I mean, I've got kids who are past this age, but I wanted today to have a look, and I thought about the kids that are this age. And this is nothing to do with the school, but this is a third grade class. This is the size of the children we're talking about. Right, this is not the class. I'm not putting up pictures of images, but this is a public photo of a third grade class in America. It was grades 2 to 4. This is the size of the little human beings that we're talking about. And if you can't do what I can do and think about my kids when they were 7 or 8, you know, then you can look at this photo. make it clear again. This is not the kids. I just wanted a representation of how little these people are. Anyone else?
I mean, we know what my stance is on gun violence. I connect this to a broader issue. I don't think anybody deserves their life being cut short through gun violence, whether that is through a mass shooting of an individual, through armed conflict or warfare, or so I think that's something I think about too. I feel it shouldn't be so difficult for us to have empathy with who is not us. And it shouldn't take people to look like us for them to have empathy with them. It shouldn't have to be our child. It shouldn't have to be our parent or our great parent, our grandparent. We should have a capacity to have empathy for humans. And I've been thinking about that quite a lot. And I think in the aftermath of the, what's going on in the Ukraine, and always thinking about what's happening in Palestine, and thinking about, also Afghanistan. And I always think this is the sheer violence that we see sometimes that happens as a shock effect for us when it happens here or in our backyard. But to remember that for people, that's their everyday reality. And because we can't see them, or because they don't look like us and we can relate to them, we somehow don't feel their pain. So I think that's what I'd seen that clip earlier on social media. And I thought, like, we're appealing to people to say, why is it so hard for you? Why is it so hard for you to recognize the human damage that happens, right?
I agree, and that's why I find the sort of words that are used, tragedy and a minute's silence and so on, they're just, in that context, it's a tragedy if there's a bus crash, if a rock falls off a mountain and pushes a bus down a ravine and kids die. That's a tragedy. But this is way, way, way bigger than a tragedy. And I mean, seriously, the 213 this year. I mean, what happened for 209 and 206 and 184, and I mean that is that people saying don't be numb to it, but that is so shockingly frequent, so shockingly frequent. And look at the kid was 18 or something, like the one in Buffalo, I think, was similar kind of age. I mean, what kind of society is generating people who do that? It isn't just that they've got access. Having access to weapons makes a big difference. If they went in with a knife, they might kill a few people. They wouldn't kill so many. But what is it that's generating that level of violence and anger amongst men? Or is it exclusively men? If it's not, it's pretty much.
Yeah. George, look, I'm when I say I'm done, I don't feel the need to cut out quickly now, but I'm as is obvious, I guess, to say I'm done. I'm done with this. Not done with this and like I can't be bothered. It's like I'm done with that part of the conversation. I think I've said what I need to say and shown what I need to show, but I'm here.
Yeah, I want to say thank to Mahdis and David for coming on. I mean, it's nearly 20 past 11, so cheers heaps, guys. I think we got to like heaps of stuff there as well, and I really liked that we sort of dug in on some of the, the way that we pose some of these questions as well when it came to the looking at the media and realizing how the media's production of reality when it comes to beneficiaries or whatever it is goes hand in hand with a historical trajectory of neoliberalism, as David was discussing, right? That the media production of these realities or these characters goes hand in hand with a political agenda. So yeah, thanks, folks. It was good to have you on.
Yeah, very much appreciate you coming on, Mahdis, again. And David, lovely to meet you. And thank you for coming on. George, as always, you're a legend. And for the rest of you, we will be back again tomorrow night from 10 p.m. for another edition of Big Hairy News. Stay safe through the night. It's probably too late to go and hug your kids now. Hug your kids in the morning. I might go hug my kids now, even though they're asleep. I'll wake them up. Go hug the dog and hug the kids. And we'll see you tomorrow night from 10 p.m. Thanks, team. All the best.